Yeah.
I look forward to this class. I was on another Zoom call yesterday, and one of the individuals who's not Jewish asked if he could sign in. I didn't know if that was okay
Sure.
or not. I gave him the link. He seems very interested. So
Okay.
his name is Ed Halloran. So if you see him on there, you'll
And
know who he is.
okay. Good to know.
Rabbi, am
Yes.
I on? Yeah. Has there been any update about what's happening at the synagogue?
I think yes. So we just decided that starting tonight at 7:30, we're going to have evening services the way we've been doing Shabbat services. So just 10 people who are invited to come. So we have our minyan in the building, and then we can do a full service. And they're going to do Mincha and Mariv.
When you say invited to come, you have to be less than 65. Is that right?
That's we're going to
That
stay
is
to that
correct.
at least for the first while. And
I don't know
but
what you're going to do on the holidays. There's so many people over 65 that will be so disappointed,
yeah.
including me.
The holidays seems so far away because
Yeah, we don't
we're
know
sort of
yet
day to
what
day.
we have to see what it's going to be like, whether things
Yeah, I
stay
understand.
calm over the summer or they get worse, whatever. So,
Rabbi,
Yeah.
this just isn't a crazy halakhic question. You just phrased the 10 people in the building.
yeah.
Is that the way CBY counts a minion as long as it's within the walls of the building
Right. Yeah, well, not in the building, in the
In the room.
sanctuary.
in the sanctuary?
Yeah,
Okay.
they'll be all in the sanctuary. So they're participating in one place, and that constitutes the minyan. So we can do a full service, and then other people can watch online and say amen to the blessings and do kaddish.
Hmm.
Got it.
Yeah. All right. Well, I guess we should we get started?
Sure, I'm ready.
All right. Let's see. Sharing screen. Oh, still I have to.
Oops, sorry. All right, you're
This,
ready.
this
Okay.
should be this should be an interesting presentation with lots of people not agreeing.
Yeah. Well, yeah. We'll see how that goes.
Yeah.
Okay. So what I'm gonna do is we'll begin this class. This is gonna be the class where I'm gonna talk about who wrote the Bible, and this is based on the first two classes. So in the first class, we saw, or I argued, that there were separate two separate stories of creation, one in chapter 1 and the other in chapters 2 and 3. They're both very familiar to us, and we sort of, in our minds, kind of mush them together, but they are, if you read them separately, they seem to be two separate stories that differ in some significant details. The first one, God creates the world in 6 days, and it's all about a process. It's a scientific description of starting with chaos and imposing order on that chaos, so that the creation is a process of creating order, separating light from darkness, water above from water below, water from land, with trees, and then animals in the three realms of the earth, water, air, and then finally land. And the pinnacle of creation is the human being. In the second story, the human being seems to be the first created out of dirt, and then a garden is planted. The human being is put in the garden, and then animals are created afterwards, brought to the man to name. He has no partner, so he's put to sleep, and and God creates a partner for him out of his rib. So again, two different stories, two different ways that God is interacting with creation. One, God just commands with the word, and things happen. The other one, God is sort of more intimately involved with the human being. Um, and neither of them, as I pointed out, is very scientific, at least not science as we understand it today. So then we looked last week at what can we know about God, and I pointed out that there is not one Jewish view about God, but many different ideas about God that don't necessarily all fit together. but that sort of gives a framework of possibilities for Jews to believe. There are some limits of what Jews believe about God, but within those limits, there are many different arguments and disagreements about the nature of God and what we can say about God, and therefore what we can say about the Torah. So now what we're going to look at is who wrote the Bible, and this has been a study that really took off in the 1800s with a few German scholars. The most famous is Wellhausen, who started to look at the Bible linguistically and realize that certain words are used in certain texts and they're not used in other texts, and vice versa, and that certain texts seem to have a certain perspective of God and human beings, and other texts had a different perspective, and that you could actually like pull apart the virtual sentences in the Bible and paragraphs in the Bible and create distinct sources that are all unified in language and understanding of the nature of God and human beings and so on, and that they form complete separate units. And it appeared that there were 4 texts that got woven together. So what I'm going to do is kind of show you some of the elements that sort of try to substantiate that view. So I'm going to share now a text here. Who wrote the Bible? So the traditional view, as I say, is that God sort of dictated the 5 books of Moses to Moses, either all at Mount Sinai. Some people really want to push everything to Mount Sinai, making that a very unique place. Or some was dictated at Mount Sinai, and the rest was dictated over the course of the wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. And Moses took good notes as God's secretary, and the notes he transcribed onto parchment, presumably, and that very lengthy double scroll of parchment is what Moses wrote and passed down to Joshua. So there's some problems. First of all, chapter 1, if God dictated the words, specific words to Moses, and God is inerrant, God doesn't make mistakes, how could God describe creation as it's described in chapter 1 of Genesis, since, like I said, that doesn't really correspond to good science? Trees are created on day 3. The sun, moon, and stars are created on day 4. We know that that's not the order of creation, that the trees need sunlight for photosynthesis. And not only that, but if really God was describing creation, he would have started with the Big Bang. And the first thing in our solar system was the sun. Again, in this chapter 1, not created till day 4. So if God was describing to Moses exactly what happened, it doesn't seem to make sense. I realize, for those of you who are out there reading books, that there are some Orthodox Jews who have written books, even a physicist who's written a book that tries to correlate modern science with the story of creation, but I think that takes a very sophisticated and maybe convoluted way to think about it, and if just a simple reading of it, clearly it's not scientific. There are other problems in the Bible. Miracles, the 10 plagues, the parting of the seas, the sun standing still for Joshua, and so on. How do you understand those things that the Bible describes? Did God interfere with the laws of physics for them? And again, I think there was a program on History Channel or something where it tries to describe how the 10 plagues could have been done without violating the laws of physics, starting with some volcanic eruption and so on.
Can we ask questions as you go along, or you want to?
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yeah.
Why do you want to base everything on science? I mean, if you're trying to compare science to the Bible, it's never going to work.
Well, right. So, So hold that thought. That's a good question. Right. Yeah. I want. Here's what I want to say. I want to be able to say that my personal beliefs, are not contradicted by what science believes is true. Right. So I feel like I personally need to adapt my belief system to at least something that is not outright contradicted by science. Right. So, however I interpret the Bible, that's how I need to interpret. I personally need to interpret it.
Okay.
Okay. So there are two. Uh, Getting more into Wellhausen's problems, there are several anachronisms, things that are written into the five books of Moses that it's hard to believe Moses wrote, and we'll look at some of those. And then there are contradictions and parallel stories in the Bible. It's like, so which version did Moses write? And if he wrote both of them, why didn't he put the pen down and say to God, "Wait a minute, you told the story differently before"? Um, so there's sort of contradictions, parallel stories. Um, D over here is a problem that I had as a child, actually. Why is, if Moses was writing this down, why did he always refer to himself in the third person? Now, I suppose stylistically an author can choose to do that, but it seems like it would have made more sense for him to say, "God spoke to me, saying," this is what God said to me. And I struck the rock and the water came out, right? Instead of Moses struck the rock and the water came out. There's something awfully peculiar, it seems to me, about the entire book being written in third person. Moses is third person. And the last element is kind of my own thing I added about language and literature, the history of what we now know about the development of language and literature. And I suppose it's arguable that it's not very good proof, but I will present arguments that just what we know about general history of language and literature, it's not likely that Moses wrote the five books of Moses. Okay, so let's take a look at those things first. Okay. Here is a list in the handout of some anachronisms first. I give you the topic items and then the chapters and verses cited. Most of the ones highlighted in yellow we'll look at, but not all of them. So the ones in yellow I thought were the most interesting, but you can look them all up on your leisure. I'll point out some of them. So the very first one I want to point out is an anachronism. In Genesis chapter 12, verse 6, it says that Abram, before his name was changed to Abraham, passed through the land as far as the site of Shechem. This is, God came to Moses and said, "Go to a land that I will show you." So Abraham's following God into the land, and he passed through the land as far as Shechem, at the terebinth of Moreh, and then it says the Canaanites were then in the land. So you might say, "Big deal, Rabbi. What's the difference?" It's just a few words. The Canaanites were then in the land. So the question is, why did the author have to tell you that the Canaanites were then in the land? What was the author trying to say with those words? So there's two possibilities. One is the Canaanites had already come to the land before Abraham, letting you know that the Canaanites had arrived before Abraham got there. Okay. The other possibility is the Canaanites are no longer in the land at the time the author's writing. And so he's trying to remind his readers that when Abraham got there, there were Canaanites there. The Canaanites were there at the time Abraham got there. There aren't any Canaanites anymore, but that's who was living there when Abraham got there. If it's the second opinion, then Moses could not have written that sentence. Because at the time Moses is writing, the Canaanites are still in the land. So he doesn't need to remind you that they're no longer there. And in fact, Wellhausen was not the first to discover this problem. A Jewish Spanish scholar named Ibn Ezra, who lived in the 12th century, and I took this from the Sefaria website, which you can go to. They have a bunch of Jewish texts online. So Abraham Ibn Ezra's comment on Hakanani az ba'aretz, the Canaanite was then in land, Yitechen she'aretz Kanani tipsha Kanaan miyad achar, that the Canaanites came in immediately after. Ve'im enenu, and if that's not the case, enenu ken yesh lo sod v'hamaskil yadum. If that's not the case, that the Canaanites had just arrived, then there's a secret here, yesh lo sod, a secret, v'hamaskil, the enlightened one, should be silent. So Ibn Ezra already realized that this probably is telling you that Moses didn't write that phrase. And in fact, Ibn Ezra goes on to cite about a dozen places in the Torah that Moses would not have written because they're anachronistic. They don't fit well with the time that Moses lived. And he says about these 12 passages, you should remain silent. Now, what Ibn Ezra, just to be complete full disclosure, Ibn Ezra was not thinking about Wellhausen's 4 different documentary hypothesis theory. He was just saying there's some phrases here that are anachronistic. And what he probably had in mind was something that apparently was very common. Remember that Ibn Ezra lives before the printing press, and the Torah had been copied by hand for centuries before the printing press. So scribes are copying out the words. And every now and then, a scribe might make a notation in the margin of the text, something he adds. And then a later scribe, seeing this and making a copy of it, would see the notation in the margin and say, oh, he meant to put that over here. And all of a sudden now that marginal notation gets inserted into the text itself and becomes part of the Bible. And now that's copied ever after as part of the text. So what Ibn Ezra was probably trying to say was, some scribe in a later generation after Moses inserted that phrase to try and explain to his readers. By the way, just remember that when Abraham got to Canaan, the Canaanites had already come there, or were just getting there. The other version. The Canaanites were in the land. They're not anymore because I'm now writing after the Israelites have conquered it. But just to remind you that when Abraham got there, there were Canaanites there. And so he inserted that little phrase. So Ibn Ezra was just suggesting that some phrases in the Torah were not written by Moses, were written by a later scribe who was copying the text. That seems to be as far as he was willing to say. But even that, he said, you have to keep secret because you'll upset the masses. You know, that the text isn't a pristine version of what was given to Moses at Mount Sinai. Here's another anachronism. There was, okay, Daniel, let me see. Daniel, why don't you, what's your question?
I only know this from watching TV. So I understand that from a historical, archaeological, sociological point of view, many scholars believe that the original Israelites were actually Canaanites that sort of, for whatever reason, broke off to build their
Yeah,
own.
that's
So
I might address that at the end if you remind me. I'll come back to that. Come back to that concept.
Okay. Basically, it sounds to me like when he goes, then the Canaanites were in the land. He's almost saying that is that
Okay.
we were the Canaanites that were there. Once we arrived, we became the Canaanites.
Oh, yeah. No, I don't think that's the idea.
Right.
I think this is written at a time after the Canaan has been completely conquered by the tribes of Israel.
All right. Well, I'll give you your meeting back. Your
Okay.
class.
Okay. Carol had a question. You can unmute, Carol? No? Okay, so we'll go on. Okay, so here's another one. Another one where the Canaanites and the Perizzites were then dwelling in the land. Just another passage where that happens. That's in Genesis 13:7. Oh, Carol.
Okay, sorry. This is Carol Emery.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is happening to everybody else, but when you're sharing the screen, we get a very good audio from you. When you are not doing that and we're just seeing you, as much as I like seeing your face, it's very bad broadcast, and it's hit and miss and coming in and out.
Oh, okay.
Mine is working fine for what it's worth, Carol.
Okay.
Oh.
All right.
Mine's working fine too.
Okay.
Mine's fine
Mine
also.
too.
Okay, good. All right, let's go on. I'll try and fix it if I can, but let's just go on. Okay, here is one of my favorite anachronisms, King Og's bed. So at the end of the book of Numbers, the Israelites encounter King Og of the Amorites, and he is a giant, and they defeat King Og and his people. And it happens at the end of the book of Numbers. Right? The book of Deuteronomy, now Moses, according to the Torah, is standing on Mount Nebo, which is on the edge of the Jordan River, on the east side of the Jordan River, what is now modern-day Jordan, and looking out over the Jordan River to the west, the land of Canaan that the Israelites are going to go in and conquer, right? And from Mount Nebo, he gives several long sermons. The entire book of Deuteronomy are 3 long speeches that he gives to the Israelites before he dies. And here at the beginning of the book of Deuteronomy, he's recounting a lot of the things that happened to them along the way since they left Egypt. And so he reminds them, we seized at that time from the 2 Amorite kings the country beyond Jordan. That's where he's standing now. From the Wadi Arnon to Mount Hermon, the Sidonians called Hermon Sirion, and the Amorites called it Sinir, whatever. In case you were wondering, you didn't have it in your GPS. All the towns of the tableland and the whole of Gilad and Bashan, as far as Sarah and Adre, the towns of Og's kingdom in Bashan. Only King Og of Bashan was left of the remaining Rephaim. Those were the giants of days of yore. And his bed, an iron bedstead, is now in Rabbah of the Amorites. It is 9 cubits long and 4 cubits wide by the standard cubit. So a cubit is from the tip of your finger to your elbow, and therefore it's about 18 inches long. So it's 1.5 feet. So when it says 9 cubits long, his bed was like 13.5 feet long, and 4 cubits wide would make it 6 feet wide. It's a huge bed, and it's made out of iron. Why is it so huge? Because King Og was a giant. Why is it made out of iron? Because he weighs a lot, and he would crush But the real question is, why is Moses telling you that his bedstead, an iron bedstead, is now in Rabbah of the Ammon? By the way, they think that's basically where Amman, Jordan now is. So in any case, why does he have to tell you that his bedstead is now there? They just conquered him. They just killed him. They know where his bed is. They were all there. This seems to be a sentence that's inserted by someone who's trying to prove to his listeners or his readers that this thing really happened. I can prove to you that we really killed this giant. And how do I know? Because his bed, you can go take a look at his bed. It's still in the town of Ammon. Go check it out, right? Moses doesn't need to do that. He was just with everybody when they fought the battle just a few months ago. So again, an anachronism for Moses to say that. This is one where it says, as is still the case, as is still the case. We're going to skip over those. Here is Moses just before he dies, chapter 34. He goes up Mount Nebo. God says, you can't go into the land, but I will show it to you. And Moses sees from the summit of Pisgah, opposite Jericho. And the Lord showed him the whole land of Gilad as far as Dan, all of Naphtali, the land of Ephraim and Manasseh, the whole land of Judah, as far as the western sea, the Negev and the plain, the valley of Jericho, the city of palms, and Zoar. In this description of the land, Dan, as far as Dan, has to be way up in the north, which is in fact where the tribe of Dan ended up settling. However, here I'm going to read you the summary from Wikipedia to describe what actually happened. As a consequence of the pressure of the Philistines, Dan was initially supposed to settle in the land around Tel Aviv, the middle west end of what's now Israel, not way up north, right? But that coastal land where Tel Aviv is was inhabited by the Philistines, who was a powerful group of people. And as a consequence of the pressure of the Philistines, the tribe, that is the tribe of Dan, abandoned hopes of settling near the central coast and instead migrated north of Philistine territory, and after conquering Laish, they refounded it as their capital and named it Dan, up in the north. Thus, their territory, in the end, lay northeast of Naphtali, east of the upper Jordan River, near its eastern sources. So here is a map over here. The first arrow over here is where Dan was supposed to be, this green area. Moses is standing somewhere around over here, looking over the city. Don ends up settling way up here. And that description I read you from Deuteronomy would put Don up here because he's just already described the rest of this territory in the rest of the text. So if that's the case, if that's the case, then Moses wouldn't have written Don up north, because in Moses' time, Don wasn't up in the north, right? The geography is wrong for the time of Moses. That's the long way of saying that that particular thing. So let's go back to the text. And finally, another one of my favorites is that Moses writes about his own death. In fact, most of chapter 34 is about him dying and being buried. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died. That means Moses wrote this. Moses wrote that Moses died in the land of Moab at the command of the Lord. He buried him in the land of Moab near Peor. No one knows where he's buried to this day. To this day, right? Again, Moses could not have written that. Not even Joshua could have written that. It would have had to have been written generations later. We still don't know where Moses is buried. Moses himself would not have written that he died, would not have written that he was buried, and would not have written that we still don't know where he is until this day. It reminds me of that scene from Monty Python and the Holy Grail. You'll forgive me if nobody's seen the movie before, but it's a fun movie, and we're all on time out from nature, so you have time to stream movies. It's a fun movie to watch. So Monty Python and the Holy Grail have this scene where they're in a cave, and they're getting a clue about where the Holy Grail is, and they're reading the inscription on the cave wall, and it says, "It's in the castle, ah," right? And then they turn to each other and say, "Where is the castle? Ah." And one of them suggests, well, maybe the guy died while he was writing it on the cave wall. To which they answer, "Don't be silly. Nobody writes ah when they're dying." And in a similar sense, Moses is not going to write Moses died while he's dying. It just doesn't make any sense. And even Rashi and Midrashim, early Midrashim, noticed the problem of Moses writing about his own death. However, not willing to give up on the idea that God gave the entire 5 books of Moses to Moses, one Midrash suggests the last few verses of the book of Deuteronomy were given to Moses in scrambled letters. That's how important it is that Moses gets every last letter. Even this last part, he got in scrambled letters that he couldn't decipher. And when he died, Joshua unscrambled the letters for him. Okay, now let's, so anyway, those are some anachronisms. Now there's some parallel texts. This is kind of a fun one over here. Jacob's name is changed to Israel. The most famous one, the one we all remember, is that he wrestled with an angel. That's in chapter 32. And at the morning, he wouldn't let the angel go until he blessed him. And the angel said, "What is your name?" And he replied, "Jacob." And he said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with divine beings." Yisrael. El is a divine being, and Yisrael is to strive. "You have striven with the beings divine and human and have prevailed." So the angel changes Jacob's name to Israel in chapter 32. But then we read in chapter 35, this is when they're coming back to Bethel, where the place where he stopped when he first left home. And it says, God appeared again to Jacob on his arrival from Padan Aram, and God blessed him, and God said to him, "You, whose name is Jacob, you shall be called Jacob no more, but Israel shall be your name." And he named him Israel. And you just kind of want to say, God, where were you 3 chapters ago where your angel already did this? Why do you need to do this again? So that's one parallel place. My favorite parallel place, which we'll spend a little bit of time on, is the story of Joseph. So, so Joseph is has made a nuisance of himself with his brothers, and his father Jacob hasn't helped any. Jacob loved Joseph more than the other brothers, and Joseph was a spoiled kid, He got the special coat of many colors. He felt very important. And then on top of it, he has these dreams in which all his brothers are bowing down to him. And even in one of his dreams, his mother and his father are also bowing down to him. So his brothers, needless to say, are very upset with him. So they decide they're going to kill him. And one day, Jacob sends his son Joseph out to go see how the brothers are doing, and the brothers see Joseph coming from a distance. So this is chapter 37 of Genesis. So they saw him. They're going to pick up the story here in verse 18. They saw him coming from afar. They saw Joseph coming from a distance. And before he came close to them, they conspired to kill him. And they said to one another, "Here comes that dreamer. Come now, let's kill him and throw him into one of the pits. And we can say that a savage beast devoured him. And we'll see what comes of his dreams." But when Reuben heard of it, he tried to save him from them. He said, "Let's not take his life." And Reuben went on, "Shed no blood, cast him into that pit out in the wilderness, but don't touch him yourselves," intending to save him from them and restore him to his father. So Reuben has a plan to try and rescue Joseph. We're not going to kill him. We'll throw him into a pit. And later on, while the brothers aren't looking, I'll rescue Joseph. I'll save him and bring him back. So when Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped Joseph of his tunic, the ornamented tunic he was wearing, and they took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it, and they sat down to a meal. Looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilead, their camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum to be taken to Egypt. And Judah said to those brothers, "What do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Let's sell him to these Ishmaelites, but let's not do away with him ourselves. After all, he's our brother, our own flesh." His brothers agreed. When Midianite traders, not Ishmaelites, right? We just had Ishmaelites. Now we're having some Midianite traders pass by. They pulled Joseph out of the pit. So who is the they? Midianites or the brothers of what?
Midianites.
Midianites. Okay, the Midianites pull him out of the pit. The Midianites sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites who brought Joseph to Egypt. Is that what we want to say? So
Yes.
the Midianites took him out of the pit. Midianites sell him to the Ishmaelites, not Joseph's brothers. And the Ishmaelites bring him to Egypt. Okay, one possibility. Reuben returns to the pit and sees that Joseph is not in the pit. He tears his clothes and he goes to his brother and says, "The boy is gone. What are we going to do?" So they took his tunic and they slaughtered a kid. They dipped it in blood and they went back to their father and they said, "This is what we found." And the father said, "Oh my God, my son's tunic, a savage beast devoured him. He tore his clothes." And all his sons and daughters sought to comfort him, but refused to be comforted, saying, "No, I will go down to mourning Sheol." Thus his father bewailed him. But now it says, the Midianites, meanwhile, sold him in Egypt to Potiphar, a courtier of Pharaoh and his chief steward.
I have to admit that's very complicated. First they sold him to the Ishmaelites, and then they
Now the
delivered him to
Midianites have
Potiphar.
him again.
Makes
Yeah.
no sense.
Well, some people had wanted to say that the brothers sold him for money, but if the brothers had sold him for money, why is it that Reuben is surprised when he goes back to the pit and finds it empty? Okay, so obviously now I highlighted the yellow and bold-faced for a reason. It seems that there's two slightly different versions of the story. So let's just read the highlighted version first. They see him coming from afar, and they conspire to kill him. But when Reuben heard them conspiring to kill him, he tried to save him. He said, "Let's not take his life. Let's cast him into the pit," intending to save him and restore him to his father. So they took him and cast him into the pit. The pit was empty. There was no water in it, and they sat down to a meal. And here I'm just going to add a little note that when they sat down to a meal, they did not sit down right next to the pit where Joseph was. First of all, it's not pleasant having your lunch while your brother is screaming and yelling from a pit. You know, I mean, indigestion. Aside, but so aside from that, we'll see that they had to be sitting at some distance away. They're out of sight from the pit, is the point. Midianite traders then pass by and they pull Joseph out of the pit while the brothers are sitting down somewhere else. Reuben has to return to the pit. That's the clue that they really must have been some distance away from it while they were eating, because now Reuben has to return to the pit. And that explains why they didn't see the Midianite traders take him. And saw that Joseph wasn't there. That's why he's surprised. He didn't see the Midianites coming. He tears his clothes. He returns back to his brothers who are still having lunch. And he says, the boy is gone. Now what are we going to do? And the Midianites bring him to Egypt, to Potiphar, and sell him there. Okay? One story where Reuben tries to save him by putting him in a pit, but Midianites foil the plan by stealing him away and selling him as a slave to Egypt. The other version, they see him they conspire to kill him. So they said, here comes that dreamer, let's kill him and throw him into the pit, and we'll say a savage beast devoured him. We'll see what comes of dreams. So when Joseph came up to his brothers, they stripped him of his tunic, the ornamented tunic he was wearing. But looking up, they saw a caravan of Ishmaelites coming from Gilad, their camels bearing gum, balm, and ladanum. And Judah, not Reuben, but Judah, says to them, what do we gain by killing our brother and covering up his blood? Let's sell him to these Ishmaelites, but let's not do away with him ourselves. After all, he's our brother. His brothers agreed. They sold Joseph, the brothers sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver to the Ishmaelites, who brought Joseph to Egypt. End of story. Also, I guess they slaughtered the tunic and they brought it back to, they slaughtered an animal and covered the tunic with blood and brought it back to Jacob. Right. So, any case, that is, so there are two different versions, cleverly woven together, look like one story. One where Reuben is the hero, one where Judah is the hero. One where Midianite traders take him to Egypt, and one where Ishmaelites take him to Egypt. But there are a number of these parallel stories. If this was the only story that was parallel, you'd say, okay, that's very nice, but we can explain it away. But there are many, many parallels like this, and they use different language, different words. As you know, different writers, people who study English literature, for instance, can spot Hemingway because of the language he uses to write, as opposed to I don't know, one of the other famous writers, right? Certain people have vocabulary they like, and the biblical writers are no different. Daniel, did you have a question?
Just, I'll try to keep it quick, fast, Rabbi.
Yeah.
So if we look at it historically,
yeah,
there were people sitting around campfires and they told these two stories over hundreds of years.
Yeah.
Okay? So somebody at some point decides to sit down and record them.
Right.
Okay. It would seem to me that those people were probably quite capable of reading what we just read and seeing how the storyline, it doesn't make sense. So
yeah.
Why, assuming that that's the way it happened, I'm taking God out of the picture. Well, why would they do that? Why wouldn't they understand that this is not, it's not telling a linear story? They didn't try to
right.
merge
Okay.
the two. They told totally different things.
Right. Okay. Hold that thought for a second. Right. Well,
that's fine.
We definitely have to explain that. Okay. So you now have sort of the basis, sort of the elements. I mean, there's lots and lots of these examples. I didn't want to bore you with all the details. If you would like to read more, though, there's a book called Who Wrote the Bible by Richard Elliott Friedman, where he lays out lots of evidence for this hypothesis, and then explains how it was done.
He was at Beth Yeshurun about 2 years ago.
Yes, he was at Beth Yeshurun about a year ago. Yes. Yeah. So he wrote the book Who Wrote the Bible, and it's really a very good, easy to understand explanation of what happened. Okay, so let's take a look at my argument here, which I don't know that anybody else makes, but just something that kind of fascinated me, the history of literature. So this is from Wikipedia, a brilliant source. I highlighted over here, many texts handed down by oral tradition over several centuries before they were fixed in written form are difficult or impossible to date. And that is the case with much of the human literature from all over the world. So, for example, early examples of the Epic of Gilgamesh in its Sumerian version predate 2000. The Egyptian Book of the Dead, written on papyrus, probably around 1250. That's about the time of the Exodus from Egypt, we believe. But the story probably dates from 18th century. But the question is, how much could you have written in these early centuries, the time when Moses lived? And what kind of tools and instruments did you have to write on? In 1250, apparently the Egyptians were writing on papyrus. So it's possible that Moses could have copied the 5 books of Moses on papyrus, and that could have been carried around. One of the problems, of course, with archaeology is material like papyrus and parchment don't last for centuries. They disintegrate over time. And we just don't have lots of examples of papyrus and certainly not parchment from this long ago, 1250. What we do have are carvings in stone and clay, which would not disintegrate over time. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is written in clay or stone, carved into clay sheets, tablets. The problem if Moses had written the Torah in clay tablets would have been that the Torah is so long that it would have taken cartloads of tablets to lug around the desert for 40 years. Virtually an impossible task. So unless it was written on papyrus, which apparently was a technology available back then, but even so, we don't know that. I don't know how long a book the Egyptian Book of the Dead is, but my guess is it's not that long a book. Not like the 5 books of Moses. The Iliad on the Western world, in Greek, the Greek language only started around the 8th century. The Greek language, the alphabet, is only as old as about the 8th or 9th century. Moses, again, is around 1250, would have been around 1250 before the Common Era, 1200 before or 1150 before the Common Era, somewhere long before the Greek alphabet was even invented. And the Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, which are somewhat long books, but again, I don't think they're as long as the 5 books of Moses combined, were only written in the 8th century, centuries after Moses wrote, Moses lived. Here are 5 independent Sumerian poems of the Gilgamesh, later used as a source of combined epic. The first surviving version of this combined epic dates to the 18th century. Later standard versions dates from the 13th to 10th centuries. That's closer to Moses' time period. But how many tablets was it written on? 12 tablets. Well, 12 tablets is not like 5 books of Moses. So the 5 books of Moses, in other words, is a much longer literary feat, something that we don't have any evidence that anybody else was doing at that time period. And that even the technology of writing such a long document would have been challenging. The oldest Hebrew stuff we have dates from about the 10th century. The oldest examples of ancient Hebrew is from the 10th century, which would have been 200 years after Moses. Again, this is just my argument I threw in here. I suppose it's not the strongest argument that could be made. I haven't seen other people make it, but there it is. So now that we, many scholars believe there were different documents, how did they come about? Well, the original theory from Wellhausen was that there were 4 documents, and they were J, E, P, and D. Wellhausen made the assumption that anywhere in the 5 books of Moses, pretty much, that talk about God as Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton, the 4-letter name of God, that was the J source. In German, J is a Y sound, right? So Yud He Vav He would be J. And anytime God is referred to as Elohim, which is a much more generic term for God, when God is referred to as Elohim, that is the E source. And then Wellhausen said there is a lot of material that is really about the priests and about ritual purity and sacrifices, and all these details would have been preserved by the class of scholars in the priests that would have had to keep track of all these details for their rituals. And so that represents the P source. The priestly source is all of that material. And by the way, elements of the Exodus story where Aaron plays a large role is a P source because Aaron was a priest. So that's P. And finally, D is the book of Deuteronomy. And D also may have influenced certain passages in the earlier books. But mostly Deuteronomy is D. And the reason they want to make Deuteronomy different, just briefly, is that in the book of Leviticus, for instance, when you want to bring a sacrifice, you just take your animal to the local shrine and you sacrifice your animal. In Deuteronomy, there's only one place to bring a sacrifice, the place that God will show you, which of course ends up being Jerusalem, the temple in Jerusalem. And there are certain other elements. That's one of the major things that's different in the book of Deuteronomy. But some, in the repetition of the laws from earlier, they're restated in slightly different ways from a different perspective that sort of all sits together well as a certain religious viewpoint. And therefore, scholars believe that Deuteronomy was written later by somebody else. Certainly after the monarchy, after the temple becomes the central focal point for sacrifices to God. So that's D. So JEPD, that was the original theory. Richard Elliott Friedman has done some more thinking on the matter, and other people have also done a lot of archaeological research since the late 1800s, and we've uncovered more material. And so now, before I explain what we think happened, let me just give you some important dates in biblical history. Abraham lived about 1700 before the Common Era. The Exodus, let's say, as I said, was around 1250. That assumes that Ramses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus, and we can date Ramses II because the Egyptians have very good archives of who lived when, who ruled when. So if Ramses II was the pharaoh of the Exodus, then it happened around 1290. The conquest of the land comes next. King David would be around the year 1000, just to keep it simple. He conquers Jerusalem and makes it the capital of the tribes of Israel. After him comes King Solomon. And when King Solomon dies, the kingdom is divided into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. In the northern kingdom are the 10 tribes of Israel. The southern kingdom are the remaining 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin. The tribe of Levi has been scattered amongst the 12 tribes altogether. And to keep the number 12, then the tribe of Joseph was divided into Ephraim and Manasseh, both of whom are in the northern kingdom. Hope that makes sense to people. Okay, so you've got a northern kingdom of Israel, southern kingdom of Judah, and they remained divided the rest of the time. There was no civil war, as it were, like America had, to preserve the Union. The North secedes from the South and remains a separate entity. However, about 200 years later, the Assyrian Empire from the east comes in and conquers the northern kingdom and destroys it and takes the 10 tribes captive, and that's why we have the 10 lost tribes. They're lost because they disappear from history after that. Except that we assume that many of them, because the conquest took some time, we assume that some of them fled south to join their cousins in the southern kingdom. And they brought with them their versions of their history. Okay? Then King Hezekiah is attacked by the Assyrian Empire a few years later, but King Hezekiah has prepared for them. He's fortified the city of Jerusalem, and it miraculously survives the assault, and the southern kingdom is preserved. Later, King Josiah does renovations in the temple, And in the process, according to the Bible, he discovers the book of Moses, which modern scholars believe was the Deuteronomy book, because one of the things that King Josiah does is he destroys the shrines that existed in the outer little villages, because the local shrines were not properly monotheistic. And we have archaeological evidence for that. Little shrines with little figures of a male god and a female god and things like that. The local country bumpkins didn't get the new religion quite. So Josiah said, we're going to have none of that. We're going to wipe out all those local shrines. You want to worship God, you got to come to Jerusalem where we can watch what's going on and make sure it's done the right way with the one God. And the temple becomes the sole place where sacrifices can be offered. And that is why many scholars believe that the book Josiah claims to have found in the temple when he was doing his renovations was in fact the book of Deuteronomy that was being written about that time to give religious support for his enterprise of centralizing the sacrificial system in Jerusalem. Then comes the prophet Jeremiah, who prophesies the destruction of Jerusalem. The Babylonians do in fact conquer Jerusalem and take people captive. In captivity, Ezekiel prophesies to the captives saying, we're going to return. Sure enough, the Persian Empire conquers the Babylonians, and the Persians tell the Jews to go home and rebuild. The second temple is rebuilt, and Ezra the scribe returns from the exile with the 5 books of Moses in his hand and reads it to the people aloud, and they say, yes, this is our story. Okay, now you have the historical background for me to explain what Richard Elliott Friedman believes happened. If you want to read his book, he goes into much greater detail, giving a lot of evidence to support what happened. J and E are not only different because of how they describe God as Yud He Vav He or Elohim. J tends to take a Southern Kingdom perspective on the history, whereas E, a Northern Kingdom perspective of the history. And so in the story of Joseph that we read, right, there were 2 heroes. One was Judah, one was Reuben. Why are there 2 different heroes? Because, again, assuming, as I mentioned earlier, that literature, and as Daniel Bissonette mentioned earlier, the assumption is that all literature was originally told orally and later written down by scribes. So the stories are being told orally in the 12 tribes of Israel. The tribes separate from each other, and you have a northern kingdom and a southern kingdom. And they continue to tell their stories, but their stories morph somewhat in the telling to fit the area where they live in. So the J version of the story now is slightly different than the E version of the history. But when the northern kingdom is attacked and the survivors flee and go south to join their partners and their cousins in the south, they bring with them their versions of the story. And now some clever scribe has to transcribe both of them and blend them together to one story that everybody can agree is what happened. Now let's take a look at the story of Joseph, right? In one version, Judah is the hero. In the other version, Reuben is the hero. Which version do you think was the Southern Kingdom version of the story? Judah, right? Our mascot, our ancestor, Judah, of the tribe of Judah, was the one who tried to save Joseph. He was the good guy. The Northern Kingdom version was, no, it was Reuben. Why Reuben? First of all, he's a Northern Kingdom tribe, but more importantly, he is the firstborn, and the firstborn child is always the responsible one. So Reuben was the hero of the story. He tried to save Joseph. But somehow now you've got these 2 versions of the story, and it morphed from Ishmaelites to Midianites. Let's pull them and mush them together and make them one story, and now everybody's happy. So that's basically what happened there. Richard Elliott Friedman then argues that, Richard Elliott, so somebody asked who wrote the book. It's Richard Elliott Friedman, Friedman. Okay. So So here you have the northern kingdom seceding from the south. I put a kind of a line in here between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom of Judah, right? And J is Yud He Vav He, or the Judean text. E is Elohim, or the Ephraim, the north. Oh yeah, I forgot to mention, the northern kingdom is sometimes called Ephraim by the major tribe of the north. So conveniently, E can also stand for Ephraim, referring to the northern kingdom. And J can refer to Judea, or the southern kingdom. P is indeed priestly material, and D is Deuteronomy. Richard Elliott Friedman argues that Jeremiah, who lived and started his prophecy, or at least lived during the time of the Josian Reformation. This is, I believe, when he was a prophet. So, but he lived earlier. Oh no, the Deuteronomic reform, yes, was in 621, right? So Jeremiah is already a prophet by then, right? So he lived during the Josiah reform, and he believes that because the language used in Deuteronomy is very similar to the language used in the book of Jeremiah, that Jeremiah himself may have written Deuteronomy, or if not Jeremiah himself, his scribe Baruch, right? And so he wrote Deuteronomy and the book of Jeremiah. And as for who edited the whole, all four texts together, it was none other than Ezra the scribe. So Ezra, in exile, scribes are not just scribes. They don't just copy books. Since they are the literate ones, they are also the ones who are responsible for maintaining history and the documents and keeping the documents in order and so on. So Ezra is a master of the history and the historical documents. And what he does is he takes the documents that he has and he just edits them together and puts them into a whole unit, brings them back from the exile, reads it to the people and says, this is our story. So Ezra was the final editor.
And we have historical evidence that he actually existed. I mean, he's not a character, a historical person.
Well, that's a good question. We don't have a lot of evidence outside of the Bible. I don't think that there was an Ezra the scribe, but we're now in a period where we are starting to get a lot of archaeological evidence to support the sort of surrounding culture and world that the Bible is describing. I used to be able to say that Baruch ben Nuriah, who was Jeremiah's scribe, they actually found a clay seal. You know, the way documents were written in the ancient world, they would be written on parchment and then rolled up, tied with a string. But instead of using wax, sealing wax, which is what later people used to seal the documents, they used wet clay. So they put a blob of wet clay on the string, and then they'd take their signet ring, smash it into the wet clay, and when the clay hardened, it would make a seal. And that way, again, you knew that the document was authentic as long as the seal wasn't broken. And thousands of clay seals have been discovered in archaeological digs. But unfortunately, also, there are sometimes forgeries that are found in the open market that are not found in situ, right? Like, archaeologists like to find the clay seals in their location where they're dug up. If you buy it on the market, you don't know if it's a fake or not. So I used to be able to say that there was a clay seal that had Baruch ben Nuriah's name on it. Unfortunately, now it's being questioned as a forgery. So I can't say for sure. There is a very dramatic scene in the book of Jeremiah where he calls in witnesses, and he calls in his scribe Baruch to write up a contract of sale of property or purchase of property, that he is buying a certain piece of property in the city of Jerusalem. And they ask him, why are you going through this charade? You're prophesying that the city is about to be overrun by the Babylonians and destroyed. What good will it be to buy property now? With the new regime, the laws of property will be completely different. This will be a useless claim. And Jeremiah then gives his prophecy that this is not the end of the Jewish story, that the Jews will return to their homeland, and then this deed will become a valuable deed of ownership. Anyway, so they sign it. Baruch seals it with his seal and takes it to the royal archives. And as it turns out, archaeologists have discovered the royal archives, or what we think are the royal archives. When they were digging around the old city of Jerusalem, they found a room that was piled high with several feet of ashes, and mixed in with the several feet of ashes was thousands of clay seals. So obviously what happened? The Babylonians, when they came in and destroyed the city, they also set it up on fire, and they burned the royal document room. All that's left of the documents is a pile of ashes and all the clay seals, which don't burn. So my story used to be, who knows that this Baruch ben Nuriah seal may have come from the royal document room and was actually the seal attached to this document that we have in the book of Jeremiah. But now maybe it's a forgery, so that doesn't work. But getting back to Ezra, we don't know for sure. But I mean, there may be records in the Persian. And I'm not a scholar of the book of Ezra. There may be evidence of Ezra's existence in Persian documents. I don't think we have any reason to doubt that he existed, personally.
Thank you.
Yeah, so here's the story. So let's say the scholars are right. Let's say the stories of our ancestors were told orally for generations, that there were some variations that occurred, that scribes later diligently wrote them down the way they heard them, that the discrepancies were somehow woven together to make a whole. And that's how we got the 5 books of Moses. And it wasn't dictated word for word, letter for letter to Moses at Mount Sinai. Does that affect the authority of the 5 books of Moses as our founding document? And I would argue no. And so what I've given you in the handout, the last several pages, are the concluding chapter of Richard Elliott Friedman's book, where he points out that the question Wellhausen and archaeologists and Bible scholars were asking was not who inspired the book or who revealed the ideas of the book. The scholars were just asking who actually wrote them down and when were they written down. And so who wrote them down and who written them down were human beings, apparently not just Moses. And it happened over centuries of time. But that doesn't mean that the ideas and the concepts weren't inspired, not only in their original form, but in the way they were edited together, and in fact, the way they were finally edited together. I did a sermon just yesterday about the meaning of the song Yerushalayim Shel Zahav, Jerusalem of Gold, by Naomi Shemer. And I'm not going to repeat the whole sermon now, but I think in some way she might have been inspired to write those beautiful words the way she wrote them. And she apparently, I think, hinted at that fact in the words that she wrote for the song. That she, suddenly had this flash of insight and inspiration that enabled her to write a song that she was really struggling to write for quite a while, and put it together, and it's beautifully put together. So I see God's inspiration in lots of things, and I think the Torah is still divinely inspired, in my opinion. It just has a more complicated history than simply being transmitted word for word to God. And this goes back to our idea about God. How does God, how do we know anything about God, and how does God communicate with people? And actually, that's next week's topic. How does God communicate with people at all? And when you see that piece, then this piece will make a little more sense, maybe. Okay, any other questions?
Very good presentation. Now I'm very confused.
Okay, that's okay. Confusion is great.
So now I'll have to read Rabbi Friedman's book and see what I think.
Yeah, he writes it really well. By the way, his latest book was The Exodus, How It Happened and Why It Matters, right? So there's been a lot of people saying, oh, the Exodus never happened. And anyway, it doesn't matter whether it happened or not. And he says that's completely not true. We now have lots of evidence that there were Jews in Egypt as slaves, or Hebrews, ancient Hebrews as slaves in Egypt, that there was a group who left, and that they brought with them certain ideas that they could only have gotten from Egypt. And
This must be written by the same people that say the Holocaust never happened.
Yes, well, yeah. It's a little bit easier to argue that something that happened 3,000 years ago didn't happen.
Right.
And of course, there's no Egyptian records, but why would the Egyptians want to say anything about losing a group of slaves, right? Nobody ever says that. Interestingly, when King Hezekiah survived the assault on Jerusalem, right, the king of Syria, Sennacherib, writes in his official records, I had King Hezekiah trapped like a bird in a cage, which is true. He had laid siege to the city, and it was about to be destroyed. What Sennacherib doesn't write is he failed. He failed to conquer the city. He failed to capture it. He failed to destroy it. And of course, he's not going to write that. That's, he's writing the news, so he's not going to write about his failure.
I read somewhere a long time ago that Egypt was, or somebody who represented Egypt was suing the Israeli nation for never returning all the gold and silver that we took. And then we said, well, okay, then you pay us for all the years that we were in.
Yeah, I see that periodically around Passover time. I'm not sure it's true, but it's kind of funny.
Well, I'm going to research that, and if that's true, that'll certainly speak to the Exodus.
Yeah, we should. Right, we should get paid for that. Right. Yeah. Right. Okay. Any other questions?
Nope.
Okay, so if you'd like to read more about this idea, you can read Richard Elliott Friedman's book. It's really easy to read. He writes it like a mystery novel, and kind of fills in a lot of the details. And then next week, I'll talk about why none of this bothers me at all. In fact, I'm happier it's this way than the other way.
Happy Shavuot.
Okay. Shavuot.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Morgen. It was wonderful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thanks for joining us.
See you soon.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.